Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, you give us glimpses of where we are meant to go. In the strengths that we find in ourselves, in the needs that we see in the world around us, in the things that fill us with passion. Please continue to give us what is needed to answer your call. Amen. So it's not acknowledged, but I'm going to acknowledge it. Okay. Yeah. Is it? Do you want last call? If you don't want me to.
No, you're fine. Okay.
So Sarah wrote that song. I don't know if you guys knew that. So that's yeah. So that's a Sarah original, maybe the only one. Yeah. She described it as like she had one complete song in her. That was it. So, which is totally fine. It's a good one. So I hope you're paying attention because the sermon is kind of a footnote to the song, but they fit together very nicely, I think. So as I promised this morning, I'm going to share a couple of Bigfoot stories. Not my Bigfoot stories. These are Bigfoot stories that I was told. And of course, they're stories, and so my version may not be exactly what was said. But almost none of you know that, so I'm not going to worry about it. And those of you who do, just, keep it under wraps. So just to give you a little bit of review, we were out in the hills of West Virginia, working on a house for a homeowner, a fellow by the name of Shannon, and his mother who lived with him, Donna. Both wonderful, lovely people. Donna was kind of stuck in the house for the most part because she was dependent on oxygen. She was dependent on a significant amount of oxygen, so really they had to change the tanks every few hours. So it was difficult. If she had to go to a doctor's appointment, it was a whole planning procedure with multiple tanks in the car, and so obviously no smoking in Shannon's house. And so when Uncle Eric, Shannon's Uncle Eric, came, he was a smoker, and so when he wanted to have a cigarette, he'd come outside and kind of hang out and talk to us while we're working. And since it was nice weather, but it was still hot. It was nice summer south weather. It wasn't like this, right? We would welcome a chance to take a break from working and talk to Eric and hang out with him while he had his cigarettes. So during one of these talks, I think it was sort of a long lunch, we ended up sitting down in sort of a circle, and Eric's like, do you want to hear my Bigfoot stories? It's like, absolutely. Please. This is like, I didn't know this was on my bucket list, but it was. So he has two Bigfoot stories. A little bit of background. Eric is a hunter. He hunts in the hills and the valleys around where he lives in this region of West Virginia. And none of this AR-15 nonsense. Like, Eric is a real hunter. He uses a bow and arrow, or he uses a muzzle-loading rifle. So like Civil War, pull out the thing, tamp it down, flintlock, one shot, and then you're done, right? So he's legit in my unschooled opinion. And he's a hunter. He hunts. He said he's hunted 100 deer. He's lost count, and he'd hunted about a dozen bears, black bears up in the mountains. So to get close enough to a black bear to shoot it with an arrow in the forest is something, right? Probably as far as this room is long. And he uses these animals. He's not just, putting their heads on his wall. Like, he's using their fur, he's using their claws, he's using their meat. He's hunting them for the purpose of having more food for him and to share with his family. So on one of these many, many, many hunting trips over decades of his life, he is up in a hide, which I don't know if you know, it's sort of a platform that you put up in a tree, and then you camouflage it, and you're up in this platform hanging out for hours, waiting for something to come along the trail beneath you so you can shoot it. And so he is up in this platform, and he sees something coming down the trail. And it's just a sort of, he just sees fur glinting in the sunlight between the trees. And as this thing gets closer, he realizes, he thinks at first maybe it's a person, walking along the trail, right? Because it looks kind of like hair on the head, but it isn't, because he notices how close the head is to the tops of trees, and it's way too tall for a regular person. It's far, far, far taller than a human would be. He thinks, is it a bear? But it can't be a bear because, bears are big, but they walk on all fours. They can stand up, right? But they don't walk around like that, okay? So he's just watching this furry head move down the trail. He basically forgets he's hunting. He forgets he's holding a weapon. He forgets he's in this hide. He's just watching this tall, furry creature walk down the path and then disappear into the trees. And then he thinks belatedly, if I had shot that, I would have had proof of what I think I just saw. But he was so surprised and so in awe and wondering what the heck it was. And I respect someone who doesn't shoot something he's not sure what it is. That's A+. A+, Eric, thank you. So that was his first Bigfoot story. His second Bigfoot story, he and his friends are out by a lake camping up in the mountains. They're fishing, they're hunting, and they're just kind of spending the weekend camping, right? And one night, now Eric admitted they had been drinking, but not like super, just regular drinking, right? So one night they suddenly hear this inhuman screaming coming from near their camp. And that was his words. He was like, it wasn't a sound he'd ever heard a person make. And then sailing into their camp comes a snapped-off sapling. It looks like it was just snapped off at the base or ripped out of the ground and flung into their camp like a javelin. And it crashes through their camp, and there's this screaming, and then more pieces of trees and rocks come, and he and his friends just panic, and they run. They flee the camp. They leave all their stuff there. They run back down the mountain, all the way back to familiar territory, and they run home. And then the next day, they go back up the mountain to their camp, and they see like pieces of trees flung around, and the camp is wrecked, but they don't see any definite sign of what did all of this. But again, Eric suspects that was his second Bigfoot encounter. So Eric wanted to assure us that he's not necessarily a full-on true believer. Like, he's a smart guy, right? And he thought, the one thing that makes me skeptical about my own experiences that I wonder about is, as I said, he's a hunter, and he's familiar with his land. He's been hunting for 30 or 40 years in the same hills. He knows them really well. And especially in winter, he said, I can track a mouse in winter if I want to. If I'm out in the snow, I can see everything that has come and gone by its tracks. And he said, I have never seen a single Bigfoot track. Not in the mud, not on a trail, and not in the winter in the snow. He's like, so I've had these experiences, I think I know what they are, but then again, I wonder because I've never seen the tracks, and he's a very skilled tracker. He would expect to see some evidence. We talked about maybe Bigfoot migrates for the winter and heads down to warmer climes. We didn't know. But those were his Bigfoot stories, and I was so excited to talk to a very reasonable, intelligent person who, wouldn't, I don't think he was just spinning a tale. It seemed genuine. But I'd never had that one-on-one encounter with someone who was like, look, I think I've seen Bigfoot twice. So as I thought about what to preach for this service, kind of a silly idea came up in my head. I thought to myself, all right, can I talk about how is God like Bigfoot? Can I compare those two? It sounds like sort of a youth group kind of thing you would do, or something silly you'd put on a church sign out front to catch people's attention. It's like, can I do anything with this? All right, how is God like Bigfoot? I thought about it for a while, and I landed on, how is encountering God like encountering Bigfoot? I felt like that was a more plausible question to look at. And when I thought about it that way, I could see some parallels between Eric telling his Bigfoot stories and other people telling their stories of where they've encountered God. Now, to be clear, I don't want to be excommunicated. I'm not saying that God and Bigfoot are comparable. But experiences of Bigfoot and experiences of God, I think, are in some ways comparable. I thought back to when we had Minutes for Inspiration that George was organizing. Remember that? We had a few years where we had people come up and give a minute for inspiration. And the way that George even described it, right, it was something like a God sighting or a God moment. And people would talk about how they'd had this experience where they felt like God was involved or that God appeared to them in some way. God showed up in their life in the situation. And they'd tell their story. But when you tell stories like that, people who weren't there with you might be skeptical. Like, a lot of times the story depends on who was there. Similar to a Bigfoot story. That sometimes it ends up with just saying, oh, yeah, I mean, you had to be there. We've heard that before. You had to be there to understand. One of the reasons for this is that God rarely leaves evidence that other people can see. So in many of our stories of God showing up, we don't have something to show for it, like a footprint or something permanent we can point to and say, you know, God stood right there, or God touched this, or God had this effect that you can see. I can bring you to my house and show you where God showed up. Or I can bring you to church and I can show you the place where God appeared. That usually doesn't happen. Usually, when we have an experience of God, an encounter with God, we're not left with solid evidence that we could hand to a skeptical person and say, look, here it is. You can't deny this. I saw that as a similarity. You know, I thought of Eric not being able to show us a footprint. You know, not having tried an arrow on the Bigfoot that walked past his hide. God encounters are also more common with believers than with non-believers. They can still happen to a non-believer, but I get this impression that people who see Bigfoot are, on some level, kind of looking for Bigfoot. And people who are out in the woods who have no intention of looking for Bigfoot, have no interest, they still might have an encounter, but it seems much more rare. And I see something comparable with God, that people who go through life expecting to encounter God and to see God are more likely to than people who go through life with no expectation that God's going to be involved. Now, those people who don't expect God to show up can still experience God. I have no question there. There's plenty of stories like that. But it seems more rare. It seems like people, in a way, find God because they're looking. And that might be comparable to people seeing Bigfoot because they're out there looking. Now, there are some very important differences between God encounters and Bigfoot encounters, right? That should go without saying. One of the really important differences is that God, unlike Bigfoot in Eric's experience, does leave tracks. God leaves tracks. As God moves through the world, as God moves through lives, God does leave signs here and there. Maybe not something you can, take a plaster cast of a footprint and show it to a skeptic and say, how do you explain this? But there are tracks, like tracks in the snow, that last for a little while but might melt in spring. You can see God's tracks in relationships that have been reconciled. People who were torn apart, who drove one another apart, and who did the work to come back together and reconcile. I think that's like a footprint of God that we can see, maybe follow. People who have experienced healing and restoration and new life in their lives, we can see that as like a footprint of God. Okay, God was here, left a little mark. When we experience or see someone experience peace, it doesn't seem to make sense. It surpasses understanding. That can be a mark of God's passage. When we find that we have the courage to resist, like I talked about last week, or the courage to tell the truth when it's very difficult to tell the truth, that could be a mark of God's passage in our lives that someone else could see. Whenever we see beauty in our experience of art or our experience of nature, I think that those are also tracks that show us maybe God has been this way. Maybe it's something we can follow. I think all these things and others show God's movement in the world, like tracks in the snow. So, how did Eric have these Bigfoot encounters? Right, he only had 2. And I'd estimate Eric was maybe in his 50s. It's hard to tell sometimes. He was somebody, if he said he was in his late 40s, I might believe him. If he said he was in his 60s, I might believe him. He was in that kind of range. So that means he's been up in the hills and the hollers, hunting and tracking and trapping and camping for 30 or 40 years. From his tell of it, pretty steady. And in those 30 or 40 years in the same hills, he had those 2 experiences. It's about one every 15 to 20 years. So how did he have these experiences? I think he had them because he spent a lot of time in Bigfoot's habitat. He put himself there day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and so he was able to have these experiences, right? If he was like me, mostly indoors in the suburbs for most of my life, I'm not likely to have a Bigfoot encounter because I'm not in Bigfoot's habitat. He is. So then, okay, as we're coming to a conclusion here, I thought, what is God's habitat? What is God's habitat? How do we put ourselves in God's habitat day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, so that we are more likely to encounter God? And that's where I came to these 2 examples that I chose as readings this morning. First, from Exodus, which tells us that God's habitat is outside the camp. But there is this massive encampment of people committed to God and following God out into the wilderness, but God doesn't show up in the center of this camp. God doesn't present God's self at the big tents of the important people. God's habitat is outside the camp. Moses has to go and pitch a special tent and bring Joshua, son of Nun, with him so that God will come and speak to him, so he can encounter God. And people see it happening, but it happens outside the camp. It happens on the margins. It happens among people who are outsiders, who are at the edges. And if we put ourselves in that habitat, eventually we become people on the margins. We become the outsiders. Maybe like Joshua, son of Nun, we never come back in the camp once we're out. Maybe because we realize God meets us out there and not in the center of things. The second reading is from Mark, the post-resurrection story. As you read or as you heard, the women are heading to the tomb because the men are terrified. They've locked themselves in their room. And they're not leaving. So Jesus' female followers, the the women have headed out to go and try to tend to his body. They weren't able to before because it was the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath, even holy work like this. So they get their supplies together, probably take a lot of deep breaths, cry some tears, and then head out to the tomb looking for Jesus. And they encounter someone in the tomb dressed in white who says, "Don't be afraid." And so we know they're probably an angel, because that's how angels always introduce themselves. If an angel had a business card, they'd hand it over and it would say, "Don't be afraid." So we figure this person's probably an angel, right? And this angel says, "You are looking for Jesus among the dead. He's not here. Jesus is alive, and he's gone ahead of you into Galilee, just like he said he would. And so you need to head into Galilee if you want to find him, because you're in a tomb and you're not going to find him here." And women who hear this are terrified and flee and say nothing. But I think what this tells us, it tells us something else about God's habitat. That God's habitat is in part that God has gone ahead of us into the world. If we are looking for God, we're always playing catch up. We're always following God from behind. We never pull ahead. And God goes out ahead of us into the world, into the villages, among the poor and the oppressed and the outsider. And if we want to find God, that's where we need to go. And the truth is, we would rather not. We would rather stay where we are and have God come to us. Have God present God's self in the narthex. God pop onto YouTube chat to encounter us. We would rather have the people we're meant to reach out to show up at our door, put a sign out front, say, "Hey, we're ready for you to come to us," and then wait. We could do that. But we should know if we do that, that is not God's habitat. And our chances of encountering God don't drop to zero, but they do go down. Encountering God is never a guarantee. Eric spent a lot of time in the hills and the hollers, never seeing a Bigfoot. Encountering God is usually a surprise. It's when we're doing something else, but we're in God's habitat, that God shows up. And if we want to have these encounters with God, if we want God to be part of our life, we have to make sure that we put ourselves where God shows up. Amen.